Activate Your Introvert, the weekly show to help leaders build performance by understanding introversion. In this week's show, are you getting your staff to have downtime? Question of the week: are introverts always quiet? And a discussion with Guy Hansen. Guy is a publisher based in Winchester, serving the area for many years, focused on giving residents and advertisers what they want. But just before speaking to Guy, the news is of course still dominated by parties and perhaps by accountability in a different sense to that which Guy and I will be talking about shortly. But fortunately, there are a couple of other things in the news too. The big working from office push, well, at least by some firms and maybe the civil service. I look forward to exploring the results of that over the next few weeks, but it's good news at least that COVID cases are still falling and international travel is getting easier. One that made me smile was that goldfish, who I've always been told are stupid, can learn to drive around a room where they want to go. Yep, it's true. Researchers at Ben Gurion University in Israel created a fish-operated vehicle by putting a small tank on a wheeled platform, and it was designed so that when a fish swam towards one of the tank's walls, the vehicle moved in that direction. With reward-based training, they gradually learnt to navigate the vehicle towards a target that was observable through the tank's walls. I didn't know whether to talk from here about reward-based training or actually just the fact that maybe it's not the fish who are stupid after all, but the humans that come up with these ideas. And in Chelmsford this week, Chelmsford has been crowned the Costa capital of the country, with more Costa coffee outlets than any other town in Britain. It has at least 25 within 2 miles of its centre. Cheltenham came second with 22. Maybe it's something about towns that start with ch. And yes, I think I've been playing Wordle too much as I keep thinking about letters that fit into that frustrating word game that seems to be creeping around the place. But the coffee shop thing is interesting. Do you go out for a quiet escape coffee or to catch up with other people? I'll often go out there to grab some downtime, and it doesn't help when the coffee shop is bustling, as all the bustle noise is very distracting. A more serious question there is, how do you arrange downtime and how do you ensure your staff get enough downtime? Some people I've been working on lately focus more on getting their team to have downtime as it gets really busy, which seems almost contradictory, but they say it works. January in the UK is traditionally a stressful time for accountants, as everybody wants their tax returns finished. It leads to the owners of many firms getting stressed and trying to get more work from the overstressed staff. A couple of conversations I've had recently revealed some different approaches. One very task-driven and pushing people to do longer hours and being more directive all day long. Another, still getting long hours but insisting on the team getting out of the building at lunchtime. There's that break or that downtime. And yet another approach was similar but also getting people to take mini breaks. Wait for it, in the coffee shop. You knew that would come in somewhere. So there's no science in this, but it was interesting how the results of the coffee shop mini breaks seemed to vary a lot by who was sent to the coffee shop and when. Some people were coming back from the shop energised when the shop was busy. Some were energised when the coffee shop was empty. It's an interesting thought and perhaps another way to think of the preferences of your staff. Sending a couple of extroverts out to chat in a busy coffee shop worked well, but not so much for the quieter team members. Perhaps this is all in a different way about helping to get performance and thinking about accountability, which is where the discussion with Guy goes. I first met Guy while networking, and because Guy wrote a great chapter in the book, The Business of Humans. It's a book I've mentioned before and interviewed many of the other contributors. The details of the book are on the webpage for this episode. Guy wrote a very interesting piece on accountability, which is always an important subject, whatever type of business you're involved in. So let's Chat with Guy. Welcome, Guy. How are you doing?
I'm fine, thanks, John.
Good. So we're going to talk about accountability. I'd love to hear your views on it and kind of unpick some of the superb stuff you wrote in the book. But just before we go into all of that, I always ask my guests, are you an introvert, an extrovert? And more importantly, what's that meant to you?
It's a very interesting question, actually. Am I an introvert or an extrovert? I think I'm a mixture of the two when I need to be. I can be the showman, and I can be the person who sits in the background and picks up information that I can use later on as an introvert. I tend to be not totally introverted when I meet people, but the longer I get to know them, the more they get to know the real guy. Yeah, it's a difficult. I kind of sit between the two, I think, John.
I think that's really interesting. And like you, lots of people sit somewhere in between the two. And I guess it just depends on where you want to call the cutoff. Introvert, ambivert, extrovert. And I guess there's a couple of cutoffs we could put on there. But you might be introverted because you find that spending a lot of time with people drains you. But you have developed all the skills, as you said, to go and be the showman.
I tend to, the people that know me would say that I was an extrovert. 100% they'd say I was an extrovert. But if I'm in a new environment, I am finding out what others are like. I'm learning what others are like so that I can then best react to them when I'm on a one-on-one or in a group situation. I'm not the sort of person, if you're talking about, say, The Apprentice, for example, I'm not the sort of person to jump up and down in the air, look at me, look at me, look at me. I sit in the background, work out how everybody was first, and work out how I was going to manipulate, in a nice way, manipulate them into what I needed them to do for me, or how they would react. Manipulate sounds wrong, but
it's one of those words, though, in the English language, isn't it? It's absolutely the right word, but it's got unpleasant overtones to it nowadays.
It has poor connotations to it. But I mean, my business is based around relationships with people, long-term relationships with people. So I'm always interested in the why with people. And I can only do that by sitting and listening. The old, you've got 2 eyes, 2 ears, 1 mouth, and they should be used in those proportions, which is true. So I love to get people to talk about why they do what they do, find out their passion, and then see how I can help them based on that.
Brilliant. So let's get back to accountability. Why is it so important in business?
For your business to survive, to me, accountability in business comes to knowing your numbers and knowing everything that's going on in the background, not necessarily, to the point of extreme, but you have to know your numbers in business. You have to know people in your business, but I work alone, really. I have a freelance person working for me, but I work alone, so it's more about the numbers than relationships. But my business life previously in the corporate world has been about running teams of people, and the accountability there, the buck stops with me as their manager, the buck stops with me. So I have to know who is best for certain projects and how best to use people. And I do that mainly by listening to them in the first place and making sure that square pegs go into round holes. The right people are on the bus in the right seats.
I like that. So the other bit that was interesting, you said that accountability is where the buck stops.
Yeah.
So how...
Particularly from my perspective, I run my own business. If I don't have accountability for what I do, if I mess up, I have to hold my hands up to people and say, I got it wrong, but this is what I'm going to do to put it right. But if there's no accountability in any business, it just runs riot and falls apart, in my opinion.
So you wrote this chapter about accountability. Does that suggest that many leaders get it wrong?
I think the problem with a lot of leaders is that they're promoted for the wrong reasons. I think quite often people are promoted ahead of themselves because they may come across as extroverts. And extroverts don't always make the best leaders. It's knowing the right person for the right job. As I said, if that happens to be somebody who, if you define being an introvert as being really quiet and meek, which I think a lot of people have this perception of, then they tend to get overlooked for positions. And it's wrong, because it's, for me, whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, it's about your skill set. It's where you fit into a team. If that's heading a team of extroverts, that's fine. You don't have to be an extrovert to manage extroverts, and vice versa with introverts. It's knowing people, and you're only really going to know that when you sit and listen to them and get to know the actual person, rather than the persona that you might see in an office or within a group.
So step one of holding people accountable, in Guy's model at least, is listening and getting to know them. What do you then do? If you want to hold somebody accountable, how do you then go about it?
I would never, because I've seen it happen year after year, people getting promoted beyond themselves, and then they struggle with leading teams, and then they try to, if they're an extrovert, they try to overpower it. And that's a recipe for disaster. And very soon the wheels come off, revenues don't come in, they can't understand why people aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, what they're told rather than asked and shown how to do. And so they judge people wrongly. But that initial judgment, the biggest judgment that was wrong in the first place, was them being promoted to that position.
But having got promoted, or wrongly or rightly, and they then want to hold somebody accountable, are there good things they ought to do, or things perhaps they shouldn't do?
The one thing I think they should do is make sure that the person that they want to be accountable for something is capable of doing that. And I truly believe also that they should be mentored whilst they're doing that, because it could be a recipe for disaster. It could be perfect. They could walk into a room of extroverts and go, "Hey, everybody, we're going to do this, we're going to do this, whoop, 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 and off we go, and we do it." When that project comes to an end, there's another project to do. But within that, you're always going to need a mix of introverts, extroverts. With an introvert, for example, I think a lot of people think that introverts are people who prefer to be in the background, etc. But you can flick a switch and become whoever you want to be. If you take acting into it, if you're a one-man band and you're standing up in front of a lot of people, I know a lady who is very much an extrovert to the outside world, but has already told me that she's an extrovert in that way because she flicks a switch and it's showtime, but she considers herself to be an introvert. And the downtime, the quiet time, is when she recharges that person to become another person. Introverts, I find, work very, very well for long-term projects and relationship building, and extroverts are very good if something needs to be done immediately. Interesting
reflection. So I'm just going to go back to your time in corporate life, and where you're managing teams, and perhaps you've got an introvert that you want to hold accountable, perhaps you've got an extrovert that you want to hold accountable. Do you do different things with them?
That's a good question, actually, John. I tend not to judge people by whether or not they are perceived by others as being quiet or loud or whatever. If they're doing the same job, and for example, and they have the same criteria to meet that job, as long as I or another line manager are meeting with them on a regular basis, mentoring them to make sure that they're doing what they do, then I don't see that there should be a problem. If somebody comes up with an issue within that, then you deal with them individually. But otherwise, I think that you can manage both of them the same way, so long as they know what's expected of them, when it's expected, and how it's expected. If people step out of those tramlines and need to be, then the extrovert might need to be pulled back in a little bit and remind.
That's quite interesting then, because what you were suggesting is the extrovert is more likely to step outside of the lines.
Yep.
And then therefore, in effect, what you're saying is you would possibly spend more time checking that they're within the lines to bring them back earlier.
Yeah. But extroverts, if you envisage it as a tree, I guess, extroverts are more likely to go off at a tandem on branches and what have you, and need to be pulled back to the main trunk. Whereas I find introverts, relationship builders in my mind, from a sales point of view, they are more likely to stay on the main trunk, get to know their clients and head towards that goal at the top of the canopy without going off all over the place. Again, it comes back to the hedgehog concept that I mentioned before. Know what you're doing, stick with what you're doing, don't go off at tangents.
Any good team has got a balance of people in it. It's not all one type of thing. So
it has to have a balance.
Guy, we have come to the point where we need to finish off, I'm afraid, but just very quickly, for listeners, perhaps introverted listeners that are looking to thinking about accountability, would you have a tip for them?
As an introvert, I would just say, be yourself. If, to me, any good manager would not just look at the people that were loud, would not just look at the people who are me, hand in the air. They would look at any skill set that somebody has and build that into any team that they were building. I don't think an introvert needs to be, I think a lot of introverts probably think they need to be more in your face. No, I just need to know that an introvert or someone who's midway can do the job that's expected of them.
Brilliant. Love it. Thank you. And if I'm an extrovert and looking to hold some people in my team accountable, a tip for me?
For me, it's constant mentoring. Make sure people are accountable for the tasks they're set out to do, not going off in different directions, doing their own thing because they think they can, because they're that kind of person. If they've got a task to do, they need to stick to it with the criteria that goes with it and be pulled back onto that path, or let them go.
To help them stay in the tram lines, basically.
Yeah, exactly.
Like it.
They know what they do, but they have a habit of going in different directions.
And Guy, one final question for you then. I know that some of the listeners are going to want to get back in touch with you, whether that's to talk about accountability or to talk about your excellent Winchester Residents magazine. How can they do that?
Simply drop me a line at guy@residentmagazine.co.uk.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been really great to talk.
It's been a pleasure, John. Interesting questions. Thank you.
Some interesting points came out of that, didn't they? I always love the debate about the word manipulate. It sounds so wrong, and yet, isn't that what we all want to do when we influence others? I looked the word up in the dictionary, and it said that influence a person or situation cleverly is the definition, which doesn't sound too bad at all. And yet at the same time, another place said the definition was influencing unscrupulously. Guy made an interesting observation about people being over-promoted and how some try to power through it, and often they're extroverted, which was again touching on the extrovert bias that I've often spoken about, where we promote people because of how they come across rather than what they can do. A lovely tip for introverts in there when trying to hold others more accountable. Be yourself. Don't try to be the big in-your-face person. You can be yourself and hold somebody accountable effectively. What would you like to know about introversion in business? This week's question comes from Linda. Are introverts quiet? It's a great question. Not because the answer is an obvious no, which it is by the way, but because it touches on a stereotype which has a very sensible underpinning. Quiet and introvert are words which often get used interchangeably, and I'll be honest enough to say that I do it sometimes as well. Just because somebody is an introvert doesn't mean they're quiet. Give somebody the space to talk about something they're passionate about, where they think they'll be listened to and can talk about it in a way which others will find interesting, while there's not a load of giant egos being waved around by people. And most introverts are in no way quiet. This weekend I was with some friends, and there was somebody who is normally quiet, and she wouldn't shut up. She was speaking so much and so fast that nobody could get a word in edgeways. Yes, she was an introvert. And yet, at other times, that tendency to think to talk, the little internal processing gap that can leave others to jump into the conversation to the point where the introverts don't get to say anything, at the same time as their people energy is draining. And yes, they're certainly the quiet ones then. So quiet is a label. It can be a convenient shorthand, but labels are never something we should use to limit our performance. even more importantly, they're not something we should use to limit our team's performance. Getting everybody to interact in meetings, discussions, etc. is in the interest of you as a leader. To get the quiet ones to speak up, don't tell them to. Concentrate on getting the setting right. There's more about that in running meetings that make things happen, but essentially get the egos to be quieter, get some information, the agenda, etc. out in advance, and you will get far more people joining in with the discussion. What question would you like answered on the show? Whether you want to be on the show or just have your question answered like Linda, go to activateyourintrovert.co.uk, where there's a box for you to ask your question. You could also jump in on Facebook and discuss your version of the answers at the show's page, Activate Your Introvert.
I'm John Baker. Thank you for listening. I hope you found it useful. There's a new episode every Thursday at activateyourintrovert.co.uk and your favourite podcast provider. Till then, go be introversial, activating your introverts, building your business.